Hello and thank you for coming to check this out. Here is our 14th After Effects logo reproduction using Apple Motion 5. Here's the original source graphic. This is from Nerdsy, the same motion designer as the last one actually, and there's a link in the description if you want to check out the project at the Envato Market. So up here is the reproduction that we've done in Motion 5, and for reproductions it's quite rough still. With more time it would be better, but there are plenty of things in here that we haven't covered before, so I think it's at a state it's ready to share and show you how things are done. So if you're a beginner and you're watching, there are lots of things to learn from this one today. It's going to be a long one, about an hour long when everything's done, so we'll do the usual. We'll jump into the project file, have a look at what's in there, and then go through each key element one by one, pretty much from scratch. Okay, let's get started. Here we are in the project file, and there's lots happening here. So step by step with the elements, we've got this cursor that comes in, and there's no explicit click animation in the source graphic that we're reproducing, but I think the idea is that it's clicking on the square, and that sends the square into scale up into a bounce. This border element runs around, forms a dot to bring the logo in, and that sends the square into a second scale up and bounce. So everything kicks off from there. We've got this snaking wipe to reveal the media below. We've got these bursts running in, and if you can see these bursts popping off on a sequence, firing off one after the other rather than in unison, and then we've got these confetti elements and the tagline as well. As for the media, this is just in there for demonstration's sake. I've added some footage into this group here, but as a Final Cut title template, you wouldn't have footage in there. Of course, you'd just be wiping out to reveal the media in the Final Cut track, or you might put a drop zone in there, an optional drop zone that you could add your media into. The footage here is just for demo sakes. Right, the pointer is in this group here, and we're going to talk about using motion paths for that. Confetti groups are in here. The logo base is in here, so it's just we've got the inner element. You can see the overshoot there. We're going to look at that, how to stack two overshoots together. We've got this outer border element in here. The levels in the Gaussian blur filter is there to soften it up, but I kind of like the look as it was, just as it was naturally, quite rough like that. So we're going to look at doing the double bounce. We'll look at this border feature with the rough texture and the variation in the width as well, and this wipe. And the main thing here pretty much are these to focus on are these bursts. These bursts are easy enough to do in Motion, but we have to go a couple of steps further than just the replicator to get it done in a way that reproduces this kind of graphic here. And we can have a look at the confetti as well. Okay, so I think the first thing we want to cover is this pointer element, so let's get started with that. Okay, so we just got rid of all the other things so that we can focus on this element here. So the pointer needs to come in on a slight arc, a slight curve, then cross the x-axis, and just before the end of that movement it will dip down into the animation out. And there's a slight curvature to the path out as well. So there's 1, 2, 3 phases. A change in speed here, it goes slow, and here it goes fast again. And that's pretty much frame for frame with the source graphic. If it was just a straight line in and out, I would use the move behavior or the ramp behavior, or actually I would just prefer to keyframe it directly. But because of the slight curvature, then I'm going to use the motion path behavior. It just makes curved paths, nice and easy in motion. So I went for a stack. I've got one path in, and that will hand over to the path out. And as they cross over, you see there's some keyframes here. Those are on this upper group. So this upper group is providing that shift along the x-axis. So as the pointer animates, the main group just works like a gantry to animate everything over. And that's the build that I used to reproduce Nerdsy's graphic. But there's alternatives you could use, and we'll look at that. But while we're here, for beginners, I wanted to have a quick chat with you about the do's and don'ts of actually getting more than one motion path behavior to work on the same layer. So in our example, you can see that two motion paths can work on the same layer at the same time, no trouble. But note that this behavior in has a geometry source set, and the behavior out is just the default spline. So there's the default spline path for the behavior out, and the source for this behavior in is right here. If I was to change the layer order, then you'll see we don't get the behavior out. So geometry set motion path behaviors will dominate everything else for the layer through the duration. And if I was to try and change the behavior out to geometry, that still doesn't work. So you can't stack two geometry behaviors on the same layer either. Let's just undo that. So if you do have to use geometry, and okay, if you're a beginner and you're watching, my advice is you don't have to use geometry. If you add a motion path behavior to your group, to your layer, you get this default spline. Come to control points just to dial it back if it runs off screen. You get this default spline, and with this and with just pen tool commands, you can create anywhere from basic to quite elaborate outlines. And if you want to stack multiple motion path behaviors onto the same layer, if we have a look in here, you can see that's really easy to do. Here we have 1, 2, 3 paths, all default behaviors, all default splines, and you can stack them without any trouble. But if you do have to use geometry, and the point I'm making is for basic shapes like these, you don't need to use geometry. So don't be in a rush to use geometry if you don't need to. But just for demonstration's sake, for basic shapes with geometry, you can see here the cursor's running across all three of them, no problem. But the way they're organized is that we've got one behavior per layer, and then the next behavior goes on to the group higher, and then the third behavior onto the group higher again. If I try and add a second one, then it's going to get blocked. Okay, so that's like the general do's and don'ts if you want to stack motion path behaviors to work on the same layers or to work on the same element. Right, so let's have a look at an alternative way that we could have animated the arc in and out with the speed variation. Let's just get rid of everything else. just remove that again. Right, let's start over. So I'm going to add motion path behavior, and yeah, like if it runs off the screen, just come to control points to dial it back. I'm going to drag the start down here. I'm going to add a point and drag that up, and then drag the end point down so we get our curve in, get our path in and out. Let's add another point, make sure that's flat so we get our flattish, just doing this roughly, traversal on the X. Okay, so I can use the default spline to make the basic path that I want. And this project was previously set to 10 seconds, so the behavior is rushing up there. I'll trim that to the duration. And then let's actually trim it to 1.5 seconds. So there is the path, but now we want to put the speed variation in. So for that we want to come and grab the custom speed setting, and that will populate in the keyframe editor this basic curve here, and it's automatically keyframe from 0 to 100, so from start to end. So this is what we can use to regulate the speed. Let's say we want it to arrive here very quickly, so let's say after 10 frames I'll set a keyframe and dial that to around here, and then I want it to take some time to reach this point, so I'll set a keyframe here and let's dial that to about there, and keep an eye on the curve in the editor, because as you can see it's become warped and it will quirk it back and forward, so do some handle management to iron that out. So just roughly, we could use a single motion path behavior to animate in, travel across, and then animate out with some speed variation in there. And if I spent more time with this, I could get it frame for frame to match the animation from Nerdsy's graphic. Alright, let's jump back to the project and have a look at the next element. In the order of events, the next element is this central square, and this is going to scale up into a bounce once, and then as the logo comes in and pops up, it's going to trigger like a second scale up into a bounce right there. So if we have a look in the logo base group in the inner, you'll see there's 2 overshoots driving that animation. And so for beginners, let's go and have a look at how we set that up. I've got the square and I want to come to the inspector and add an overshoot. And I want this behavior to increase its scale by 150%. So it's going to scale from this value up to 150%, but it's running the entire duration by default and we don't want that. So we might trim it, but with the overshoot behavior, with this setting, if we trim it, it's just going to snap back to its default value of 100. So let it run the duration, and in this case let's check frames. So it's 30 frames a second, 5-second duration project. So from here to here is 150 frames. I want this to run for 1 second. So in the behavior, I want to set the end offset at 120 frames. So 150 frames minus 30 frames for the second is 120. And then the behavior won't snap back at the end. So then we want to add another behavior. We want it to do this again a second time, but we don't want to add it to this layer. It's just going to be a train wreck if we try and load two overshoot behaviors on there. You can do it, but you need to micromanage the layers scale parameter a lot, and it's just much faster to add the second behavior like we did just before with motion path. We're going to stack the second one on the group. So we're going to grab scale again, add overshoot. Let's say we want this one to start at 2 seconds. Coming this way, we could trim it at 2 seconds to start, but let's just use the start offset at 60. And if I want it to run for another second, I've got 90 frames from here to here, so I'm going to minus another 30 from that, so the end offset should be 60. And this time I want the scale up to be softer, so let's just make it 50%. So we've got one scale bounce and then the second scale bounce. And that's pretty much how we reproduce Nerdsy's graphic in motion. Okay, let's have a look at the next element. Our next element is this border feature that draws in and out, forms the dot to fall down, that kind of welcomes in the logo. And then we can see in this border element that there is some width variation. So it runs thick and thin throughout, and also on the sides it has a kind of a rough texture as well. Okay, let's go and have a look at how we put that together. I'm just starting here with this shape layer. It's a square, it's 400 by 400, and it's centered. So what we want to do is animate this to draw in and out, to run around and form that dot and fall down. So for that, we're going to animate the last and first point offset. We could use the right on behavior, but to be honest, I prefer just to keyframe them directly. But you'll know if we animate this way off the bat, just the default setting of the shape, we're not going to get the animation we want. We want what we want to reproduce our animation is the animation to start and end here. So first we want to grab our shape then and convert it from geometry with a height and width to a shape with point coordinates instead. So with that done, I can now add another point in here. Make sure that that point, the new point there, number 2, make sure that is at 0. And I'm going to right click and choose that as my start point. So you'll see if we come back to style, everything runs from that point now, which is what we want. Alright then, so let's just animate this last point offset from 0 to 100 over 1 second. And we'll just make these ease in and ease both. And right about here I want to have the first point offset begin its run and finish right about here. And we'll have that set to ease both as well. So that's what we want, but we don't want it to draw all the way out. So I'm going to come back and grab this first point offset, and at this last keyframe, that's going to finish at 99.8 instead. And that will give us that little dot there. And then to have this fall toward the center, the initial shape was 400 by 400, but now you see we've got it's by point coordinates. So this is 200 above 0 on the Y. So to have it fall to the center, we could either animate this layer directly, but I prefer just to come up and animate the group. And so I'm going to set a keyframe on the Y. Actually, we want that to happen just before the circle forms, so right about here. Set a keyframe on the Y and come forward. Let's just come forward 15 frames. Set a keyframe here at -200. And we want that curve to look more like this. And that's how we get that part of the animation done. So now we want to look at adding the width variation and the texture to the sides. Actually, the first thing we have to do is undo all of our animation so that we can get a clear view of the layer at all times. Alright then, we want to change this from solid to airbrush. Come into the stroke settings here, and yeah, when we change from solid to airbrush, we get access to these. See how it's grayed out now? If we change to airbrush, we get access to these features. So we'll come into stroke. We want to look at this one here, width over stroke. So just before we made this start point, so in this width over stroke graph now, that's the start, that's right there, and that's the end, that's right there. So if I wanted to make it thin right there, I'd add a point about here and add a point about here, and then use the width over stroke value here and here to scale it down. If I wanted to make it thin right in the middle there, I'd set another point here to buffer, another point here to buffer, and right here, if we drag that down, you should see it right about the middle. If I set this at 50%, that will be right at the midpoint there. So then you can set these to be Bezier so that we can play with that to soften everything out. That's the general idea. Whenever I work with width over stroke, I usually just start adding points anywhere and then use the stroke length slider here to move things around into place. So then we want to look at the texture. So this is the one we want to use, jitter. If I come back here to the airbrush, increase the spacing, you'll see it's made up of lots of little dots. Okay, so and they all have an XY position. If we come to the jitter, jitter kind of randomizes the XY to give us that, and then if we bring the spacing back down, you can see that's how I got the texture on the sides there. But we don't want it uniform, we don't want it running all the way around the layer, we just want it on the sides, right? So coming back to stroke, you can see there's actually a jitter over stroke. So just like we used width over stroke, we can use jitter over stroke as well. So let's reset that. I don't want to try and get it exact and accurate again. It'll take a long time and that will be boring for you to watch, but let's try and get one side done. So with jitter though, if we want to wall it off, we want to create a bit of a buffer. So I think on this side, or let's, like I say, we just start adding points, but I want to add another point inside each one because we want it to go from jitter to no jitter, jitter to no jitter, so that we get a segment of it. And with jitter, remember there's an X and a Y, so this point has both of them. if you're not careful, you'll end up splitting them up. So with this one, I'm going to just grab them both so that they both go together, and grab them both so they both go together, and kind of eyeball. Can you see where that is starting to affect? Right, so it's starting to work right about here. We managed to get it right on the side. So let's increase that value more, make it more dramatic. Let's try 75. That's what we want. Okay, about 75 here. Okay, we can really see it now. So then I can just work with this stroke length slider to move it along. Well, I'm going in the wrong direction. It's this one I want. So if I move that, okay, there we go. So we've got it working on just one side now. And then from here, you'll see that because we are using airbrush, it's quite soft. That's because the airbrush has a brush profile. Each dab, this is telling us that in the center, it's opaque. And on the outside of each dab, it's at 0 opacity. If we want to make this line a bit crisper, then we can get rid of that altogether, but I'm just gonna grab this and move it up. So you can see we're getting a sharper border there. So something like that. Okay, so yeah, like I said, I wouldn't want to try and reproduce the graphic again. It would take me a long time, and you don't want to sit through that. But for our border element, that's how we did it. So we saw before we animated with the offsets to form the circle and drop down. And for width variation and the texture, we used the width overstroke and jitter overstroke. Okay, let's go and have a look at those bursts now. So next on the list are these shape bursts right here. I'll just turn off the solid here so we can get a better look at them. The logo, by the way, is just here in this group. It's just running on an overshoot, something we've covered lots of times in our reproductions. So these shape bursts though, this actually picks up where we left off with the last reproduction we did, because these shape bursts are what I said I'd cover the last time, and I left it hanging there, so we can come full circle and get into that now. Shape bursts is something we've done before. You know, we use the line, we replicate it, but to reproduce the bursts in this one and in the last one we did, we have to go a step further. So the thing with these is you can see that they are popping off in sequence, like starting here with this one here, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. And this is the weakest part of the reproduction overall. The style, I think they got the style right. Motion can do the same elements, no problem. I just got the timing and the position of them is still a bit rough. Alright, so the shape bursts are all in this group. So they're behind the wipe. If I turn that back on, the wipeout kind of reveals the shape bursts which are already in motion, already active when the reveal happens there. Okay, let's go and have a look at these shape bursts and how they're done. Let's start at the very beginning. I just have a group here. I'm going to grab the line tool and I'm going to draw a line from top to bottom, so that'll be 0.1 down there and 0.2 up there. Come to properties and center it. Now it's important that the anchor point for this line is right at the base, and there's plenty of ways to make sure that's exact, but what I like to do is just come into geometry, make sure 0.1 is at 0, and then set the length by increasing this. So let's make that at about 150. And if 0.1 is at 0 and the shape is centered, then the anchor point is spot on right there. Okay, so this is the element we want to animate to start our burst. I'll come to last point offset and animate this over 15 frames. So half a second from here to here. You can use the ride-on behavior. I always prefer to animate these offsets directly. And there we go. So we have that, and right about here, a couple of frames out, I'm going to grab the first point offset and come forward 15 frames and animate that to 100 so it draws it out, or wipes it out. So this is our basic element that we're going to use for our burst. So that is step one right there. The next step from here is to hit the L key on my keyboard to replicate that. I'm just going to rename the line as source. Select the replicator, choose circle, outline. Let's have 10 points, and then choose align angle and set the angle to 180 to flip everything around so we get this burst animation. This is our basic burst. We've done it plenty of times in previous reproductions and other things on the channel here. I also like to animate the radius, so I'm going to set that to 100, and over the duration set it back to 200. Okay, so we get something like this, and there we go. That's a basic shape burst. But for this reproduction, we want the bursts to fire off in sequence, not all together like this. So let's have a look at one way we can get that done. First of all, let's duplicate this group, and I'm going to close that, just lock it so I can't mess with it, and let's call this one sequence 1. So this line here, this replicator works because we have our source line and we're replicating, we're making a pattern of this source line animation. So this is the animation, and we've made a circular pattern of that that fans out and animates outwards. But what we're going to do is undo that animation. So now we've just got this source layer. So I'm going to call this source sequence. Turn the replicator back on. So now all we've got is this action. I'll just turn the source off. So this time, if we want to run a sequence in the replicator, we want to use the sequence replicator behavior. Here it is. I'm going to add that, and I'm going to add scale to this, and we want the Y scale. We want to choose from. We can trim the behavior right here to match, and we want this behavior from 0 on the Y. So now we will get this. So that is firing off in sequence. Actually, let's just remove the radius animation for now. Okay, so we've got the sequence just roughly. Let's bump the spread on that. Let's make that 4. let's not, let's make it 2. Okay, that'll do. So there's our, there is our sequence there. Actually, for the sake of our reproduction, we want to reduce those points. Let's go for 7. Okay, so we get that. Actually, this is coming back to the actual reason we're going to do it this way, but then do it another way. So as you see, if I drop that to 7, we get 7 points. We need 7 per wave in the reproduction. But other than this offset here, there isn't a way to actually distribute these, like make them bunch up more. I could choose the spiral setting preset, but that still doesn't do what I want it to do. But let's just make it 7 for now. So still we have this even distribution of each point around the circle, and we've got this sequence running. But we want it to animate in, and then we want each point to animate out, right? Okay, so we're going to mask to do that. I'm going to grab this replicator and duplicate it. I'm going to grab this source and I'm going to rename it as source white. I'm going to add this source white as the source for this replicator and rename this as white. Then I'm going to grab source white, move it up a layer, group it with the source replicator so that they are in the same group. So then when I move this group forward 1, 2, 3, 4 frames, the source moves with the group. That's important. I'm going to call this one wipe, and I'm going to, let's just turn that one off for now. Let's grab source wipe and let's make the source width 20. See how that is fatter now? Actually, I want to come back to this source and turn off caps, something I forgot to do, and this source, turn off caps as well. I might have to change that. So now the second one is much fatter than the first one, right? Actually, I'm going to come in here and I'm going to make 0.1 minus 1 and 0.2151 just to make sure it's a bit longer as well. Okay, now I'm going to turn this replicator back on, add an image mask, and drag and wipe as the source. And set that mask to subtract. And that's the result. So we have the sequence popping off, but you still see these artifact lines here. I think that's because I need to grab source wipe and set caps on. That just makes sure the source that's wiping out can kind of gobble up the area of the one it's wiping, if that makes sense. So there we go. There is the sequence burst, but still this is not what we want for our reproduction. So for that we've got to go a little bit further, do things a little bit differently. So this kind of sequenced burst is cool, and it will be great for lots of things, and I've used this in work projects plenty, but for the sake of the reproduction that we're doing, it just wasn't quite enough to get frame for frame as close as possible to that source graphic. So we're going to turn these off and come right back to this first one that we did. Okay, so I'm going to grab the replicator and the source and group them and just call this number 1. And I'm going to grab this replicator and just set the points down to 1. And I'm just going to turn off the radius animation for now as well. So what I have here is a single instance of the burst. With the radius, I can extend that range out, even though I'm going to animate it. Just letting you know, with the radius you can extend it out. With the group rotation we can turn it around, so we can, position it anywhere we want. And I just used these in the last reproduction. The last one and the one we're looking at now, this is how I go about creating the exact pattern to match Nerdsy's graphic there. So in this case, this is number 1. And yeah, we can use clones as well. We could clone it. I just like to use the replicator and duplicate it because, okay, so let's imagine that you want a style that has lots of different variation in not only the position, but also the length and the thickness of the source as well. So if you clone it and you make one change to the source of the clone, everything updates automatically. But if you keep them separate, you can build your variations in one by one. So the replicator itself, we just looked at positioning with the rotation and the radius. If you want to make it shorter or longer, come back to the source. Actually, I'm going to rename this S1. It helps you when you have a bunch of them to keep a track and also to use search to locate them as well. Remember, we made sure that point 1 was at 0 and point 2 was at the next value. So if you want to make it longer or shorter, it's just a matter of adjusting this point 2. That's all you need to do. And if you want to change the thickness, then just grab the source and make the changes that you want. So let's build up an array of 7. I've got number 1 here. I'm going to duplicate that, call it number 2. Actually, I'll just grab this. Let's undo that. Let's bring the radius to 350 and animate out from 350 to 450. Okay, something like that, and actually even a bit further, so to 500. So that is number 1. Then I'm going to duplicate it, call it number 2, come 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 frames, shift it up. So the next source, I'm going to call that S2. Just good to rename things as you go, because then you can search for it easily to find it when your layers list gets a mile long. Okay, so this one now, just come a few frames so I know that it's animating. There it is. And we're going to turn the rotation up to here. Let's repeat that again. Let's make number 3. Rename the source so I can find it easily. One, 2, 3, 4, 5. Come forward 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Shift number 3 up in the timeline. Let it animate a couple of frames, and then let's move that around as well. So there we go. That is how I'm going to make my sequence with the distribution that I need, rather than the evenly distributed elements you get with the replicator. Okay, so finally I got to share that with you. That's what I wanted to share with you almost a year ago from the last reproduction. as I'm doing this, you know, I've hunted for better ways to do it. This is what I know to do well so far in motion. If you're out there, if you know a better way to go about this, please let us know so I can share it with everyone. Okay, back in the project file, just before we look at this one. So coming back and looking at all these burst groups, here I've done to reproduce as close as possible the source graphic. These are all the bursts that I've used to get that. And if I was to do it again, then I'd probably just make a few base ones and then use clones instead and shift them up the timeline like I was doing with each one. But that's what I did with the first run. So yeah, I think there's a little voice at the back of my head says there is a better way of doing it, but in my years with motion, I haven't found it so far. But if you are sitting on that knowledge, please, if you want to share, please do. Okay, so the next thing we want to look at is this snaking reveal here. It's just a basic image mask wiping out, and it's here in this background group, so I'll turn the bursts off. So I've just got this solid, and there's the image mask, and here is the source for that. So let's go ahead and do that from scratch. With this color solid, it's just something to demonstrate the wipe on. In the reproduction in the project file, we've got some footage there that's being revealed. You wouldn't have that in the Final Cut title template. I think I said before, you might have a drop zone in there for the editor to load their own media, but really I think it would just wipe away and reveal whatever is running on the Final Cut track. Okay, so let's make our wipe source. I'm just going to grab the Bezier tool and draw out 1, 2, 3 bends here and select that and turn off the fill, and then just drag everything around. I haven't centered it yet, I'm just leaving it like that. Might actually want to center it on the X if anything. Okay, so something like this, and then let's make it nice and slow over 1.5 seconds. We'll come and grab the last point offset and animate that from 0 to 100. Let's just let this run on ease both. Okay, and we'll set the width to start at 50, and we want to set a keyframe on that, and then by the end set another keyframe and dial that up so it is covering everything there. And just double checking here, we don't want it to fill up too fast, so I'm going to grab this outline width and I'm going to give it this kind of curve because we don't want it gobbling up everything too fast. That's looking a bit more like it, and I can take this point here, make it smooth, and just let that come out there so we have more negative space. That's looking alright. Okay, so I could have done one big path and then animated first and last off point from 50%. It's just faster to make one path like this and then duplicate it, then flip it around on the Y 180 and on the X 180, and then move it down. Not crop, turn on edit points, and just going to set my guides to 1 to 0, 0 and grab the original. That's about 0, 0, so turn the original on. So this is going to call that upper, going to call this lower, lower, upper. Okay, and now if they play together, we're going to get this. There we go. And now these two, let's just group them. That's our white. Actually, if we're going to work this way, I'm going to take lower and I'm going to reset that, and I'm going to link it to upper, because later on, if I want to make changes to it, I can just work on the one and it will be sent through to the other. Right, let's grab the solid and add our image mask and drag and wipe as the source. And we want to subtract. There we go, so that's how we did the wipe element. Let's go and have a look at some of those confetti elements. Okay, back in the project file, so following the wipe out, there's our layers that we just made before. And the bursts, we've got these confetti elements. Oh, and we've got the taglines here as well. I was a bit lazy with these. I haven't even run the animation through a sequence text. They're just bouncing in, and I've keyframed the groups directly for that. Overshoot just couldn't quite match the source graphic frame for frame, and can't quite get the same soft bounce in this situation. So keyframes will do. But as far as behaviors go, I'll just add these keyframes to a custom behavior, so that, you know, keyframe once, and then from then on you're just using behaviors that you've saved to your library. So you get the best of both worlds. For the confetti then, we've got these popping circles, this cross up here, and this star, kind of star shape as well. So let's have a look at how we did those. Right, here's all the confetti elements on their own. So let's start with this cross. So from scratch, I'm going to grab the line tool and just draw down so that point 1 is up here and point 2 is down here. Come and make sure that is centered, and I want in geometry I'm going to have point 1 at 50 and point 2 at minus 50, and that will leave the anchor point right in the middle. So now let's animate. I'm going to animate with the last point offset, put some keyframes on there, not there. Let's come to the start and come forward 25 frames to add the next one. Okay, so that will do. Gives us an animation like that. And then just as it reaches the 50%, I'm going to start the first point offset, and I want that to finish right on 1 second. So from 0 to 100 there. And to complete the cross, we'll just duplicate that and flip it over 90 degrees. So that's our cross animation, and there's also a slight fade in, fade out on that as well. So We'll add a fade in, fade out behavior, trim it to the end, and add 3 on either side. So there's our cross. Right, let's have a look at the circle next. I'll just add another group and add a circle, center that, set the geometry to 100, just something to work with. I'm not going to animate it with behavior, I'm going to keyframe directly, but I will link the Y scale to its own X scale. That just makes it cleaner and easier to work with in the keyframe editor. So I'm going to come back to 0, set a keyframe on the X scale there. Let's come to 25 frames, set that back to 100, and adjust the curve. Okay, that'll do. So there's our scale in. I'll just get rid of the cross. And now we're gonna come to frame 22, duplicate that, shift the copy up, drop the copy under. I'm going to rename this as wipe and make it a few pixels larger for geometry. If I give that another color, you can see that it's just poking out the side there. Okay, so now I'm going to add an image mask to the original circle and drag wipe in as the source and choose subtract. And that's how I make popping bubbles like that. Then we can trim the group and add a fade in, fade out. 3 frames in, 3 frames out. Okay, so that is the popping circle. For the other circle that draws in and out, let's just add a circle and center it. Come to style, get rid of the fill, add an outline. We can leave the caps at round, and then just like we've been doing, we're going to draw in and draw out. So I'm going to animate over 15 frames. The last point offset, let's just have those ease both, and then for the next 15 frames, the first point offset, ease both. And I think we want to turn it around 90 degrees. No, minus 90. There we go. So that's the kind of ring that we've got in our confetti groups up here, right here. Except I'd say that the first point offset is making its run quite a bit earlier than that, so let's move it back. Starting at 0. Something even further back, and bring this forward a bit. Yeah, something more like that. Alright, so the next confetti element then is this, this star right here, this one here. Let's just have a look at how this was done within the group itself. So I couldn't find a shape like this in Motion's library. I could make one in Illustrator or Affinity Designer, but to do this I've just constructed it out of a replicator and a rounded square. So there's the replicator source, there's the replicator, and sitting in the middle of the replicator is this rounded square, and it has an image mask applied, and the replicator is used as the image mask source to clip it out and make that, and then the whole group is just animating in scale from 0 to 100 and out again in time with the source graphic. So there we are. That is all there is for this reproduction. I think we definitely covered some new things that we hadn't done before, and if you're watching, I hope that you did learn something useful for your motion projects. Okay, I'll catch you later. See you in the next one.